I used to think the coolest thing about pottery was seeing fingerprints and brushstrokes, proof that an individual had left their mark on it. I didn't think the actual pots were that interesting. But recently I've been reading more about pottery, and now I think the coolest thing is how societies leave their mark on pottery, and how pottery can play into society. The first pottery we know of was used to make figurines, up to 30,000 years ago. The first vessels were probably small, and not very specialised, used for cooking and storing small amounts of food. Since if you're nomadic hunter-gatherers, it's not really practical to carry around a large collection of pots. But with the rise of sedentary agriculture, it was easier to store large quantities of pottery, and people could create more specialised vessels. So we can learn a lot about society and how it changes over time by what they use pottery for, how that changes over time, and how they adapt their pottery both visibly and invisibly. The most common uses of pottery are storing, cooking and serving food, with proportions changing over time as societies change and new materials appear. Pottery made for cooking isn't going to be the most glamorous, but it might contain minerals in the clay to make it heat more evenly, while pottery made to serve food is prettier and might contain additives to make it bad at conducting heat, so it won't burn people's hands. Some pottery isn't made to be used by the living. Many societies over time have buried their dead in large pottery jars or used pottery to mark graves. Ancient Egyptians used canopic jars to contain mummified organs, and some people were buried with pots to eat from in the afterlife. Pottery could also be offered to gods. We can also learn from how people treated pottery after using it. Sometimes even now, potters crush up old pots and use them to create new pots. Ancient Romans used crushed pots to make concrete. In the city of Rome itself, olive oil vessels were too oily to be easily recycled, and too plentiful to bother reusing, so they were systematically dumped in a pile that became a hill. In ancient Greece, shards of old pots were so commonplace that they were used to vote. The word ostracism comes from ostrakos, pottery shard. We can also use the way pottery is made to ask questions about its society. For example, how far did they go to get their clay? How selective were they with their materials? What method do people use to make their pottery? It takes about a year to learn how to make high-quality coiled pottery, but about 5 years to learn to make pottery on a wheel. Coiled pottery needs the least specialised equipment, so most people can make it at home. Wheel-spun pottery needs a wheel, so there's more likely to be specialised potters. How does their society support that? Pottery made by pressing clay in a mould is usually associated with mass production of pottery. In that case, there's often division of labour, and a lot of labour is required, which in history has been quite devalued, so why do these people choose to work in pottery? In some places though, potters have a high status in society. In many mythologies all over the world, humans were created from clay, so pottery might serve as a metaphor to understand the human body or creation. And where pots are used in religious ceremonies, potters and pottery itself can become subject to religious rules. For example, among various African peoples, there are prohibitions against things like counting pots before they're finished, letting salt touch raw clay, or letting parents of twins visit potters at work. Pottery can interact with gender roles. In the Canambo area of Ecuador, making beautiful bowls is a woman's responsibility, and competence in pottery is part of adulthood. If parents don't want their daughter to marry yet, they can tell potential husbands that she hasn't finished learning pottery. The Ogiek people of Kenya traditionally believe that if a man sees an unfinished pot, the pot will spontaneously break. Beliefs often spring up around the firing process. Firing is the part of the process that converts clay to hard pottery, but it's risky. If the heat's not controlled, most of the pots can break at this stage. People can develop ways to control the temperature and reach higher temperatures, such as using kilns. This can have repercussions for things like metallurgy. Smelting might have been discovered when potters added malachite to pottery, heated it, and accidentally smelted it into copper. Pottery can also reflect how cultures interacted. Copying the technique of pottery isn't easy, especially without modern technology, because you need to spend time with people to learn their techniques. So archaeologists can track the movement of ancient people through tracking different styles of mixing ingredients or shaping clay. Decoration is more surface level, so it can be copied just through seeing the finished product. So from the spread of decoration styles, we can learn who a society has contact with and who they decide to copy. For example, there was high demand in Europe for Chinese blue and white porcelain pottery in the 1600s, particularly in the Netherlands. At the time, the Dutch were establishing a monopoly over trade routes to Asia and creating a colonial empire. Back in the Netherlands, Chinese pottery became a symbol of colonial riches and the exoticized East, and European potters wanted to make and sell Chinese-style pottery themselves. But they didn't know how to create porcelain, so they could only copy the blue and white decoration, creating a kind of pottery known as Delftware. People might also create pottery explicitly for trade, either as containers for other goods, or to sell the pottery itself. And if the pottery itself is the export, potters might modify their style to sell better, perhaps by incorporating motifs from the target market, playing into stereotypes, or using older techniques to seem more traditional. The last thing I'll talk about is the most obvious when actually looking at a pot. The aesthetics of pottery can tell a lot about what people value. It's pretty common for pottery to be used as a status symbol, either through being labour-intensive and expensive itself, or imitating more impressive things. Some Mycenaean pottery was plated with tin to imitate more expensive pure metal cups. Delftware became popular in the Netherlands partly because only the rich could obtain real Chinese porcelain. But the aesthetics of pottery aren't just used as a status symbol. The aesthetics might be used to entertain. There are ancient Greek vases that tell stories, and drinking vessels painted with eyes on the bottom, so that when someone drinks it, the pottery appears like a mask. The female potters of Canambo use pottery to indicate their political alliance, with visual cues that only other female potters will recognise. At gatherings, people openly indicate their like or dislike for their guests by serving them with different qualities of pot. And during the American Revolution, using American-made pottery was a way to broadcast support. Some pottery embraces the aesthetic of not looking beautiful. Japanese raku pottery is intentionally simple and natural, embracing defects, and became popular because it reflected values of Zen Buddhism. But in societies where mass-produced pottery has become cheap, imperfect pottery that's obviously handmade can become a status symbol in itself. Chinese Yixing pottery gains aesthetic value through use. The pottery is left unglazed, so that when it's used to serve tea, the tea soaks into it. As the pot is used over and over, the residue in the clay gives the tea more flavour, and it also gives a dark brown colour to the pot. A darker pot is a pot with heritage. Some aesthetic choices relate to beliefs about pottery. Celadon pottery, which is made with a particular glaze, was valuable in East Asia and the Ottoman Empire because people thought that if poison was served on it, the pot would crack and warn them. South African Zulus smoke pottery for use in certain ceremonies to blacken it, as blackened pottery is considered more pleasing to their ancestors. But also a lot of people just have pottery. It's not just a status symbol or a religious object, it's part of everyday life. So some pottery designs might just be to brighten someone's day a little. There are 1,000 other ways I haven't mentioned here that pottery and culture can reflect each other. I used to think it was kind of weird that so much of archaeology was based around pottery, but it turns out pottery can be a pretty fascinating window to view parts of the world we might not consider.